You know, our next guest has been with API Cutesy for almost 14 years, so she's seen a lot of changes and advancements in the Asian Pacific Islander community. And this year, at the annual Phoenix Awards, a legend in that community is being honored. Welcome our guest, Amy Sueyoshi. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I remember seeing the cover of On Your Back magazine by Susie Bright with Kitty Tsui on the cover.
Yes.
And I was just, wow. At the time, I was going to the gym a lot, and I thought, where did she get that body? For people who don't know who Kitty Tsui was, tell them why that cover was such a big deal.
Yeah, so Kitty was an author as well as a medalist at the Gay Games in bodybuilding. She's also been an icon in San Francisco's leather community from its very beginnings. She's a big deal in the APL, the Asian Pacific lesbian community, simply because she seems to defy all the stereotypes about Asian women are supposed to be like. She's a no BS dyke, as we call it, and we sort of all aspire to be like her.
Right. Talk to me what you mean as an Asian woman about what you mean about the Asian stereotype that she rebuts.
I think there's a way in which mainstream America sees Asian women as sort of quiet, compliant, sort of run-overable, and definitely not necessarily assertive. And so there's a way in which Kitty carves out her own desire, her own opinions, her own ideology, and does whatever she wants. Mm-hmm. And she was doing this during a time when it wasn't so great to be queer, that it was not so accepted to be queer in the ways that it is now.
Mm-hmm. I have worked with Asian Pacific Islander groups for my 30 years in San Francisco, and I hear what you're saying about that stereotype. When Kitty started really just, you know, pushing back in a very vocal and obvious way, what was the response? And I don't just mean from the non-queer Asian community, but from the queer Asian community. Did anyone ever say, whoa, this is this is way too much?
I think there were some folks in the community who were thought that she was a little bit too much out there. Kitty herself talks about how sometimes she received some mail saying that, oh, you know, why do you have to be so out there? But I do think that she is a historic figure, that she did push the envelope to the edge, and she's more remembered for her bravery, her courage, mm-hmm. and her really kind of, you know, being this amazing kind of forward-thinking lesbian.
Right. Now, besides being on the cover of On Your Backs and being well known within the LGBTQ community here in Northern California and the leather community, she was also on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, correct?
I actually don't know that.
Or the Village Voice.
Yes, Village Voice.
I apologize, the Village
Voice. Yes, that's correct.
How did that come about? And did anyone ever say, well, you're being objectified?
Yeah, it was actually a woman photographer who had her on the cover of the Village Voice. She was not aware that she was going to be on the cover, but she appeared, and I do think that it was a revolutionary moment for Asian lesbians, again, Asian women, to be on the cover of the Village Voice, even if it was in a manner that Kitty was not necessarily privy to. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So much has been made this past year about the Oscar season. And before the Oscar ceremony, it seemed to be about, well, people of color, meaning African American, the black community, were being left out of the Oscars. But by the end of the Oscar night, a lot of people, myself included, were going, what's with all the Asian bashing going on? Did you feel that way? And do you have a response to that?
I do think that there is a lot of Asian bashing that goes on. When we talk about people of color, we typically we're supposed to be thinking about folks of color broadly. So Asians, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, as well as people of mixed heritage. I think it's unfortunate that Asian Americans are often evoked as easy sort of scapegoat.
And why do you think that is, especially in California, and certainly in Northern California, where it's a large percentage of the overall population?
I mean, I have my own personal opinions about it.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a way in which, you know, Asian Americans might be seen as not a group that would get angry easily, that would raise protests. These are all misconceptions. Mm-hmm. Asian Americans have been protesting and organizing since they arrived here in the U.S. in the 1840s. But I do think that there's an image of us as being pokeable and laughable at, yeah.
So you still think that's part of it? It's not just, okay, well, this is Oscar night, so it's going to be open season on everybody. We want to be equal opportunity offenders or equal opportunity comics. You think it's because there's a perception that the API community won't call in and write and protest?
I think there's a way in which Asians, as a group of color, are seen as aliens still in the U.S. They're not seen as Americans. So in some ways, they're seen as tourists, and then therefore less empowered to protest within this context of a civil rights agenda. I think that broadly, though, that the Asian American community has pressing issues around poverty, right? Immigration that need to be addressed in addition to visibility. Yeah.
So the annual Phoenix Award.
Yes.
Where did that come from, and what does it honor?
So Asian Pacific lesbians have been gathering for a banquet once a year, typically for the Lunar New Year. And because
Happy Year of the Monkey.
yes, yeah. And because folks are usually spending the Lunar New Year with their families, we celebrate it later in April. I think at one of the banquets, we decided to begin awarding community members who aren't typically recognized. And so Kitty is in a long line of Asian Pacific lesbians as well as trans folks who we've been honoring at these annual fundraising dinners.
And so what do you think Kitty thinks of this?
When we called her to tell her about the award, she started crying on the phone. So she was definitely very moved.
That's not the response you'd expect from a butch, butch Asian leather aficionado.
I think that we're all we all have emotions, and I think just because you're butch leather doesn't mean that you're not prone to being moved by these kinds of momentous things that happen. Yeah.
During the AIDS era, the leather community, as far as specifically I'm talking the gay male leather community, lost a lot of its members, but also a lot of fundraising at a very grassroots level came out of that community. What do you think Kitty would say about those years and about what the leather community has done for the Asian community, for her specifically, and vice versa?
Yeah, I can't really say what she would say necessarily, but I do know that we.
Tell her I want her on the show. I'd love to have her.
I do think that she's talked about feeling like she was the only Asian in the leather community for sure. At the same time, she's really moved with all the activism that's happened sort of before and since the AIDS crisis as well. She's very much sort of engaged in the ways people kind of promote and activate social change, right? So I do think that she's impressed by sort of the things that have gone on both during and after the AIDS crisis.
Yeah, because I think, and tell me if you think I'm wrong in this, there is a certain era, a certain age of LGBTQ activists who feel like the quote-unquote glory days are over of activism, i.e., well, things now are so milquetoast, things are so white bread, activists don't have punch anymore. Do you think Kitty is still that icon of activism that she was 15, 20 years ago?
I think that she may not be as much of an icon today, which is part of the reason why we have these Phoenix Awards, to have folks remind us of the historical importance of these actors. I also think that Kitty would she would not believe that activism is dead by any means, especially for queers of color. There's young folks who are out there sort of demonstrating, marching, right? Engaged in matters such as, Black Lives Matter, immigration reform, undocuqueer movements. These are all movements that...
So she sees crossover, and you see crossover,
Yes,
I should be more specific.
Yes.
What do you see as far as the crossover between some of these, quote-unquote, new civil rights movements?
I do think that queers of color have, even since the 70s, have always been involved in multi-issue politics. So not things that we might see as only LGBT, but anti-poverty, economic justice, immigration reform, and racial equality. And that's a tradition that's continuing today. And so when we see that the founders of Black Lives Matter are queer African-American women, that is, a big deal, and it's also not unusual. We can understand it, right? It's legible to all of us who are queer and active in the community.
Great. Only a few seconds left. Tell me what you would like people to take away from this year's awards, in addition, of course, to honoring Kitty Tsui.
So I do think that it's amazing that we can gather, that API Queer Women and Trans folks can gather in San Francisco for an annual event. It's a room of 200 to 300 API Queer Women and Trans folks. It's an incredible experience. I invite folks to come out. It's April 16th at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center.
Great. Thanks so much for being on the
Thank
show,
you.
and thanks for your work.
Thank you.
Next up, a broad historical perspective of LGBT San Francisco. Our conversation with author, researcher, and historian Jim Van Buskirk. I'll be right back.